Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. We're here in Rangeley, Maine at Orgonon, Wilhelm Reich's home, laboratory, and the site of some of his most controversial experiments. This year on the podcast, through the Schizoanalysis Project and our extended reading of the Anti-Oedipus Files, we've been exploring how desire, politics, and repression intertwine. Reich stands at the crossroads of all of these questions, a student of Freud, a radical Marxist, and later a scientist whose theories of energy and life challenged both orthodoxy and authority. Today, we are joined by professor and author Philip Bennett and the executive director of the Wilhelm Reich Museum, David Silver. And we will be discussing the history of Wilhelm Reich, his early writings about work democracy, and much more. And also very important these days, how we can understand Reich's fight against fascism and how it still speaks to us now. Philip and David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to have you here.
Well, we'll start with you, David. Can you just give us a little bit of your background and tell us about the Wilhelm Reich Museum?
Oh, boy. Well, my background is actually in computer science, but I've had a lifelong interest in the work of Wilhelm Reich since a teenager. I stumbled onto a Wilhelm Reich book. Actually, it was caused by Philip, believe it or not. He was a college professor in Ithaca, New York, and he turned some students on to Wilhelm Reich, who were friends of my older brothers, and the book made its way to the Bronx, where I was, and I started reading and got hooked. So in this period of my life, I've come sort of full circle from what I used to do and taken the reins here. Now, the history of Wilhelm Reich, that's a broad question. But I would say the simple version, how did he end up in Rangeley, Maine, for example? Well, that's because, like a lot of immigrants to New York, and he was one in 1939 when World War II was breaking out in Europe, he wanted to get out of New York for the summer. And someone suggested the Rangeley Lakes region. He rented a cabin on Mooselook-Maguntic Lake a few miles from here. And that was in the summer of 1940. And then within a couple of years, he purchased this 280-acre property for $4,000 and began building his laboratory and research institute here.
Professor Bennett, can you talk to us about your work and your history with Wilhelm Reich?
As an undergraduate at Rutgers in 1962, I had a professor who had been through therapy with someone trained by Reich. And I followed his steps. And in 1963, I began therapy with this doctor, Dr. Sobey. And so I had that passion. But when I went to become a graduate student, it had nothing to do with Reich. In fact, the one attempt to say something about Reich produced my only C in a curriculum of all A's. Sidney Hook, who was a lefty who became a right-winger, dismissed everything I had to say with reference to Reich. So my interest in Reich was sort of in the background. And I only got seriously studying his work about 20 years ago, when I first started to do my own research and started to work on this book, which took probably 15 years. The book is From Communism to Work Democracy, the Social and Political Life of Wilhelm Reich.
Excellent. So, if I'm not mistaken, you actually underwent Reichian therapy.
We didn't call it Reichian therapy, we call it orgone therapy.
Okay.
And I went through it beginning in 1963, and I think I'm still doing it. I still see my therapist, who was trained by my former therapist. So the process continues.
I see. And let me ask you this. So, I mean, I have been in therapy myself. And when you started orgone therapy, what was it that stood out to you about it or made it attractive and maybe part of your lifelong journey?
Within a few weeks, a few meetings, I accessed deep emotional release of a kind that I had never experienced. And I knew then something is going on here that's very important. And then there were other things, but it was the access to crying, raging, and the like that I never really touched. I could tear up watching Lassie, on TV, but the kind of expression of emotion was revelatory, and that's what drew me to the therapy.
So, David, have you had experience with orgone therapy yourself or any of these practices?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the college students who were friends of my older brothers, they lived in Ithaca, and they would drive down every 2 weeks in their Volkswagen bus to see Dr. Sobey. And I was about 15 years old when I first learned of all this. I went to NYU a few years later, and I began therapy with Dr. Sobey in 1980 when I was 19. And, that's sort of something that ties us all together in this sort of New York community. There were still a few practicing orgone therapists who had been trained by Wilhelm Reich at the time. And Sobey was a very special one. And like Phil, it just all rang so true to me. And I hadn't done any other form of therapy, but I was pretty well versed in what Reich was talking about. And what was important to him, he developed the whole concept of psychic defense mechanisms actually being paralleled with, or being unified with physical defense mechanisms. He called character armor and muscular armor a kind of a unity, and all of our defenses involve the holding of actual physical energy, according to Reich. And so while often therapy is thought of as occurring in the world of ideas and thoughts, this is very different. When you are pushing the envelope of your sort of comfort zone and feelings emerge from inside of you, there's a truth to that is completely, inescapable. It's not a question of, this therapist thinks this and that therapist thinks that. No,
The visceral truth.
The visceral truth of what pours sometimes out of you, layers upon layers upon layers. And, it's very extensively documented in Reich's work how these things, how defense mechanisms are built up over time, and how they might be gradually, not with any kind of fireworks or, gradually loosened, allowing an organism, which is what we are, to begin to tolerate things feelings that were at one time intolerable, that it had to guard against. So this was just my whole life, really. My whole worldview was kind of influenced by Wilhelm Reich from a very early age. And before that, I had none. I had the fake, the religious training and things like that,
Excellent. Well, maybe this next question is a question for Professor Bennett. So Reich began as one of Freud's closest students. What drew Reich initially to psychoanalysis, and then how did his theories begin to diverge?
Very good question. Actually, when the First World War ended, Reich signed up to be in the law school, but it became clear that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was going to collapse. And so he opted to go into medicine. So what came first with his interest in medicine? In his work as a student, there was another student who insisted that they have some kind of seminar on sexuality, because the regular medical study never talked about sex, never talked about sexology. So they had their own little student group, and they went to see Sigmund Freud. And they met, and Freud gave them a number of books, and Reich took on those books with vigor. And while still a student, Freud gave him permission to do therapy. So by 20 1922.
1922.
1922, thank you. What century is this? In 1922, Reich was not only a practicing psychoanalyst, he was working on what's called the ambulatorium. It was the walk-in clinic. The psychoanalyst would volunteer 1 hour a week for poor folk. But Reich oversaw that whole organization, and he had a lot more contact with the working poor. And that moved him from being a social democrat, which most of them were, to a more left position until eventually in 1927, he became secretly a member of the Communist Party. Visibly, he was still a social democrat. As for his work, so that was his work with Freud. And it became a contentious relationship because Freud insisted on being, quote unquote, apolitical, not wanting to mix the obvious left implications of psychoanalysis. Freud didn't want to touch that. And so as Reich became more and more engaged with working with concerns and working with the working poor, the distance between the two became greater. And eventually there was a falling out. It was never a big falling out, but there's a note in one of Freud's diaries saying, "Woke up with stomach ache. Get rid of Reich."
So he was a body psychotherapist after all.
For some reason, that
Or he
resonates
needed
with me. Well, that then raises the question of how did Reich link not only the psychotherapy with the politics, but with just sexuality more broadly?
Well, it became, Freud originally recognized that all neuroses was sexual in origin. But as psychoanalysis developed and as Freud became more popular and more accessible, there was a diminishing of the centrality of sexuality. Reich never let go of that. And his second book is The Function of the Orgasm. That was in 1927. It was published by Freud's publishing house, but that doesn't mean that it was embraced. In fact, Freud's first reaction on seeing the book was so thick. he probably thought, no, orgasm, 3 sentences, maybe a paragraph, maybe one chapter.
Freud did have a preoccupation with book length and oeuvre length.
There was that too.
Yeah.
There was that too. Most of his books were about 100 pages. And so that Reich's book was well over 200 pages. It could have been the too thick, might have been that the book is, but there was whatever he meant by that comment, they began drifting apart. And had Freud known that Reich was an active member of the Communist Party, I think they would have drifted apart more quickly.
Sure. David, did you want to jump in on any of that?
Yes, I want to mention, first of all, that Reich's 1927 book, Die Funktion des Orgasmus, is not the book that is known today in English, which is called The Function of the Orgasm. That's a later, more scientific history of the development of his somewhat later work. That original book is now published, most of it, as Genitality in the Theory and Therapy of Neurosis. I would also want to mention that, obviously, that's a provocative title, The Function of the Orgasm. It's not, to Reich, what is often misunderstood, because he's often the subject of just, rumor and gossip rather than actual serious study, is that the function of the orgasm is simply like a metaphor for a universal function in nature of the building up of an energetic charge and mechanical tension, and then the release of mechanical tension and energetic discharge. It can occur in a single cell or in a bladder or in our lungs or the orgasm. Now, it's no great secret, even though Reich gets a lot of ridicule over it, that sexuality is central in most people's lives. And to Reich, this was more than just a concept. He believed that when there are characterological chronic defenses, the ability for energy to flow in the body is disturbed in some way, and that affects the ability to surrender to a universal function of life, which is to discharge and let go of energy. So what is the fuel of neurosis? Where is the energy that causes all the symptoms in the patients? Well, a lot of analysts maybe didn't have an answer for that, but Reich did. It's the bound up energy that's not being discharged, right? The ability to pulsate is Reich's entire theory, really. And that's what the function of the orgasm means. It's not a how-to manual.
Right. Well, now we're on to the million-dollar question, which is fascism. Because Reich, at this point here in 2025, Reich still holds the title of having written one of the greatest treatises on the mass psychology of fascism. That's, in fact, the name of the book. And so how did Reich understand fascism differently than other Marxist thinkers at the time, other psychoanalysts, or anyone else doing an analysis of fascism?
On the very surface, right? The simplest, people tend to think of fascism as some crazy leader comes along and he convinces people to follow him with some crazy ideas. And Reich turned that upside down. No, it's the masses of people that create the fascist leader, because the fascist leader just knows how to tap into something, into a disturbance that is widespread, a lack of autonomy, a need for a daddy figure, a need to, an inability to take responsibility. So without the mass appeal of the leader is powerless. And that's why you see different cultures behaving differently in that regard.
He speaks truth. All right, so I fully agree with what David said. I will add the following, that Reich recognized, if he did accept the notion that disturbance in sexuality is the root of neuroses, when you look at the cultural values within Germany and elsewhere, there is this continued notion that sex is verboten, especially prior to quote unquote marriage. So that repression of sexuality, now, of course, it is not honored thoroughly. People always are having sex, but they do so with guilt or whatever. Behind that is the authoritarian personality. Reich had that concept long before the Adorno wrote his book on authoritarianism. But as David said, the young person or the child turns to father. It's always patriarchal family structure. And that is mirrored in the culture with teachers who carry the stick, and was mirrored in religion, where we worship this imaginary character who is the Father over us, our Father who art in heaven. So you see this patriarchal dominance of fathers who rule women and rule children. And that is the seeds of all fascism. Is what we can see analogs right now in this country, especially with the religious right and the like. All oppression of from the father down is fascism in the broad sense. We don't need to talk about particular fascist parties to see fascism.
I would certainly agree. It's more diffuse. It inhabits every vector, every institution of our society. Even when Trump was reelected this time, Tucker Carlson said something to the effect of "Daddy's home."
Yeah,
right.
There you go.
Well, it's interesting because you had sent me some of your work, particularly on Reich's concept of work democracy. And what's interesting to me is that he moved out of the psychoanalytic circle, developing his own school. He was essentially chased out of the Marxist parties in Europe, but still retained many of his left-wing sympathies. What did Reich's politics ultimately evolve into with the concept of work democracy?
Okay. So first, Reich had his falling out or his break with the German Communist Party in the early part of 1933. He was formally thrown out of the Comintern, the International Communist Party, at the end of 1933. We've dated it, I think, as December 1933. He looked to other left leaders. He had correspondence with Trotsky and actually approached Trotsky about the possibility of having a party together. Trotsky had no interest in it, and it's more complicated as to why. He continued to have his left interest. However, as he got older, he began to see that communism itself was a form of fascism. He called it red fascism, meaning that the role of Stalin was quite analogous to the role of Hitler. And there's a book that Reich wrote called The Masses and the State, where he quotes passages from a worker saying, I want my son to be called Stalin. I want, this same worship of the leadership. So eventually, around 1937, Reich eschewed the word communism. He had nothing to do with communism. And he remade his ideas along the concept of work democracy. And work democracy is not new. It's often called anarcho-syndicalism or council communism, but it's the idea that a society can exist through workers in collective groups establishing their own lives, that we don't need to, it goes without saying, we don't need the capitalists to tell us what to do because it's all beyond a capitalist system. And that's the roots of work democracy. And he first wrote about it in 1939, The Natural Organization of Work and Work Democracy. And then he wrote a sequel to it, got further problems of work democracy. However, later in Reich's life, after he had problems with the government in the United States, he did not promote those two books. And he alludes to them in the revised Mass Psychology of Fascism. It's really important to know that most people like yourself who have read the Mass Psychology of Fascism are not reading the 1933 Mass Psychology of Fascism. The one that came out in 1946 is expanded and includes his work democracy essays.
Well, you were saying that people don't read the version of the book that he wrote when he was more immersed in communist ideology.
Exactly.
And he excised all of that jargon. I would add to this that work democracy is not an alternate political ideology from Reich. He's not saying, instead of capitalism, we should institute work democracy. Reich's entire approach was a functional one, to put whatever he was studying in whatever larger context it was found. So, in other words, when it came to the institutions of society and how they might affect personal freedom and personal development, he didn't, like Freud, talk about, you've got to basically conform to the institutions of society if you're going to function in society. No, Reich said, you should at least understand the destructive forces, the destructive things that happen as a result of repression, sexual repression, and things like that. Not proposing to break it all down, as some people mistakenly say, but just in order to begin to think of a solution to a problem, you have to understand the problem. The same with work democracy. Work democracy was Reich's vision of what would happen if people weren't emotionally sick and neurotic. What would healthy people, is a term that would be thrown around a lot among the Orgone, the people who followed Reich. What would emerge if people weren't psychologically impaired? And he thought the people who know how to do certain kinds of work, who would take responsibility for that work and would not interfere with other people's work in other areas, and vice versa. And there wouldn't be bosses exploiting other people. There were, it would self-organize in a work democratic way. But it's not something that could ever be implemented from the top down, right? It's like fascism. It comes from the ground up. And that's why in Reich's, as time went on, he began to focus more and more on the futility of trying to fix people with therapy or trying to fix society, and rather with the idea of how does all this start? Well, it starts with the way infants are treated. It starts with how children are raised. And that's why this is called the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust, because his faith was in the future of humanity being improved, as it were, by raising generations of healthier and healthier infants.
Can I add something, please? Thinking about work democracy, there are instances of it all the time. And I'll give you an example, 9/11. What happened after 9/11 without organization? People drove, the firemen and what do we call them? The first
responders.
First responders drove to New York City, parked their trucks. They were around the Javits place, and without any telling them what to do, went to the ruins and tried to find bodies within those ruins. That's an example of work democracy. And it often shows up in times of stress, even though these people were neurotic and all that stuff. You know, I was in Dresden when there was a flood of the Danube, and people were just filling up bags with sand and trying to keep the water from getting into the museums to destroy the art. And in the Soviet instance, in 1917, the workers who were making bread started their own Soviets, their own groups, to get the bread out to people. So those are instances of work democracy not being organized. They don't have that label. They don't know if you said, oh, that's work democracy. They would know what you're talking about. They were doing it. But Reich envisioned a society when under circumstances, everyone would be working together. You know, the conference is finished. Who's picking up the chairs and stacking them up? You know, do you need a boss telling you to do that? You just figure out you got to do that.
Well, let's move on to talking about Reich's scientific work. We've already talked a little bit about orgone. There's also this concept of bions and his research on bioelectricity. And all of this remains highly controversial. And I know there has been some research recently to rehabilitate some of what he was attempting, because basically Reich's legacy ends with him dying in a federal prison and many of his materials being burned, and there's conspiracy theories surrounding it. So I want to clear up a little bit about that. Maybe we could describe exactly what orgone is. Does it connect to this concept of bions or bioelectricity? And what was the kind of research that he was actually doing in the lab that's just down the way here in this building?
Well, the original research on the bioelectric experiments weren't actually conducted in the States. They were conducted in Oslo, Norway, because when Reich moved to Oslo, he had a position at the university there, and that's where he did those original research. And there is a very good book about the sexuality and anxiety. I forget the exact title, but we can easily find that title.
Bioelectrical investigations. Sexuality and anxiety.
There he is. It's always good to have David when Philip Brain freezes. Out of those initial experiments, now those initial experiments were designed to show that libido was real. It wasn't just some concept, that it could actually be measured electronically with galvanic skin response. That led him to start looking at microscopic objects. And that's what gave rise to the bions. The bions are transitional vesicles, or little things that could become, under certain circumstances, become amoebas, or they become other things. They could become cancer cells. And that study of his bions initially was treated as, too absolutely ridiculous. However, now there is a new, recently done PhD from Harvard by a young woman named Jennifer Evans, showing the legitimacy of these experiments. In addition,
Bioelectrical.
the bioelectrical material. And then in addition, there's a book also published by Harvard University Press called Wilhelm Reich Biologist. And that looks at, and it's Jim Strick, and that looks at the bion experiments. I am not a biologist, so I can't really tell you what's going on in detail, but these little things can be seen and observed, and I think verified. There was just recently a conference about this in Norway where they were recording bions with video clips and the like.
Wow.
All the time having regular or official doctors, not doctors, scientists, dismissing this as pseudoscience.
Right.
And that's one of the good things about Strick's book, Wilhelm Reich Biologist, that he addresses the standard view that this is pseudoscience and shows it is legitimate science. It may be interpreted in other ways, but it's legitimate science, that Reich was really doing scientific investigations on biology. In terms of orgone, as he observed the bions, he noted strange phenomena. So when he would look at them extensively, he started to get conjunctivitis. And he wondered, what is the energy? What's bothering his eye? Or he had a plate that had some bion, and he put it on his arm, and his arm got reddened. And that led him to think there was some kind of energy being observed or manifesting in these bion experiments. And that's what led to hypothesizing of a new kind of energy, which he called orgone, and even to be able to accumulate orgone by putting it in a kind of container. Originally, he was studying bions within a Faraday cage. So a Faraday cage is a metal cage to be sure that the radiation isn't coming from anywhere else. And that led ultimately to the accumulator and his experiments with the use of the accumulator.
David, here we are at the museum, and I'm hoping before I leave today that I get to go into an orgone box, or at least see one.
Sure.
What is an orgone box, and what exactly is supposed to happen when a patient or a client enters into one of these things?
They're officially called an orgone energy accumulator.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And it's an enclosure. It can be a box, can be a blanket, but it's a directional enclosure that is designed very simply out of layers of what are described as organic and inorganic materials, although we don't mean meat. We mean things like wool or fiberglass or mineral wool, materials that are very natural, that tend to sort of absorb and hold energy, and that do not hold a lot of moisture, because moisture kind of dampens and flattens everything. Then the alternate layers are metallic, are ferrous metals like steel wool or sheet metal or metal screening that has iron content. So orgone accumulators are generally thought of to have be a certain number of folds. How many pairs of layers of the organic and inorganic? The let's say rock wool, which is a mineral wool product, like a type of insulation, rock wool and steel wool. If there are three of each, that would be a threefold accumulator. Oh. And often the boxes were built that way, with sheet metal on the inside and Celotex on the outside. And the purpose of it was simply the metallic layers tend to quickly reflect energy in both directions. Outwardly, it gets reabsorbed by the organic layer, but inwardly, with the innermost layer being metallic, there would be a tendency for the flow of energy to go toward the inside and for a field to be created. Now, since, according to Reich, an orgone energy is a word for life energy that he coined in order to differentiate it from other words that represent similar ideas, chi or prana, or things like that. So we, as energy-filled beings, have our own energy field. There's no mechanical formula to this, but our field interacts with the field created by the orgone accumulator in a way that tends to charge us up, depending on where we are and how our personal ability to pulsate. One person might feel nothing in an orgone accumulator if he sat in it every day for months. Another person might touch it and just, ooh, that's interesting. I feel warmth, but when I hold my palm a few centimeters away. So it's not a mechanical thing, but it tends to have, I wouldn't go so far as healing generally, but just effects, perceptible effects that people feel based on how more or less open they are energetically. And, on the topic Phil was talking about, I just wanted to mention the sort of the sequence of events. Reich, he talked about following a red thread throughout his entire work, right? He was always focused on energy. What is really happening in the physical world energetically when he saw patients, when they were holding in their emotions and then they released them? Well, the ones who got better, they seemed to have some kind of energetic release, right? And the sexuality, energy. So the bioelectrical experiments were an attempt to try to quantify, to show, you know what? It's not, when you have an emotion, it's not just a thought. It's not just a feeling. There's actually something happening. There's an electrical manifestation that can be measured. Then he asked himself, well, is this universal throughout nature? I'd like to look at some single-celled organisms and see what's going on there. The Bion work gets really convoluted there because the state of the art, the scientists said, well, to get amoeba, you just put some grass in on a slide and you leave it there for a while, and then they just emerge out of nowhere. He said, really? Yeah, there are spores. Really? So he got an extremely high magnification microscope and he watched this process, and he found that what he saw didn't agree with what they said. He saw the material he was looking at actually disintegrate before his eyes over time and form little vesicles, and they looked energy charged, and they started to move in a sort of lifelike or pseudo-lifelike way. And he tried to report all this to the scientific community, but none of them had ever looked at any of this. None of them had ever used such high-powered microscopes. So he put together time-lapse photography apparatus that was completely innovative so that he could document everything he was doing. And we have these films. So the Bion work was a way for him to sort of study at the microscopic level the same energetic phenomenon that interested him at the macroscopic level, and later in his life at the cosmic level. But it's not essential to the correctness of, let's say, one part of Reich's work for the Bions to be proven, or even for the orgone accumulator to be proven as accumulating that specific orgone energy that he described. The accumulator empirically seems to have an effect on people. Almost every single day of the year, someone in the world orders from our website the plans to build an orgone energy accumulator, a PDF download for $8.50 from 1952. We don't advertise it. There's something going on there, but it's not essential. There's mainstream agreement in all of Reich's characterological work, his therapy, the innovations he came up with, muscular armor, characterological armor, the whole idea of the mind-body connection. Well, not only that there's a mind-body connection, but that there's a unity of mind and body, that you don't have a mind without a body. And he, in that capacity, he's really considered the founder of all the schools of body psychotherapy. There's widespread agreement about that. So I think one of the fallacies that is, often perpetuated is that because someone can find something about Reich's work that sounds crazy or that is called pseudoscience, then throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
That's ridiculous. He could have described some of his constructions as more theoretical than he did. You know, he could have acted like he was a little less sure of himself sometimes with his later work. But regardless of all that, there's mainstream agreement that he has had an enormous influence on, the way the emotional, the relationship between emotions and, our character and our disease processes, and the ways in which child development, attachment theory, all these things. We just had a conference about this. The ways in which children are raised affect their emotional and physical health. And so we see our job not to prove that Wilhelm Reich was absolutely right in everything he ever said or did, like some kind of scripture, but to demonstrate how the widespread common ground there is, the widespread agreement that there is, that his work is incredibly valuable and is often misunderstood, misrepresented, overlooked, written out of history, revised, much more in this country than in Europe because of the particular controversies that went on here.
If I may, I've become friends with colleagues in Brazil who do therapy based on Reich's work. One of them was just inducted into the Brazilian Academy of Science, where here in the United States, Reich continues on one strand to be seen as a pseudoscientist and dismissed when it comes to his scientific work. Now, think of the contrast there between a induction into the Academy of Science versus a lot of the stuff. But as David points out, the standard pseudoscientist theme is diminishing and becoming less and less prominent. And that's because there's a lot of good people writing about Reich these days.
Well, actually, before we pass it back to David, we're heading towards wrapping up. And I'm hoping by this time, if people have been watching or listening, they're interested in the topic. So if you were to suggest to someone encountering Reich's work for the first time, what are some principal texts or first readings you would recommend to them?
What? Okay. The second function of the orgasm, that is the one that was written in English, because it is a scientific autobiography. And so you get to see the way he went from being to a psychoanalyst to this, to this, to this. The second, and from a political point of view, is a Mass Psychology of Fascism. Both the revised one with the work democracy, and coming out soon will be an edition of the original 1933 version. That's coming out from Verso pretty soon. So I would start with Functioning Orgasm, Mass Psychology of Fascism, and the book, The Sexual Revolution, because it too gives a history of the development of his thoughts about cultural and societal changes. That's right off the top of my hat.
Oh, well, before you give it to David,
Yeah.
I know that you have some writing yourself, and you have something coming out soon as well, correct?
Right. Yeah, I've published a number of articles about Reich's work, and I'm working on one right now. But my book, From Communism to Work Democracy, The Social and Political Life of Wilhelm Reich, should be published at the end of this year or the beginning of next by Brill, and a year later it'll come out in paperback with Haymarket. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to live long enough to have book studies and circulate talks about my book.
Yeah, making it to the big time. Yeah, and David, maybe you can give us your recommendations.
Well, I fully agree with Phil's recommendations. The problem has often been that if Reich's books were music, they would not be called easy listening. There's a barrier to entry with really getting into Reich and understanding it. And so now I recently put out an introductory guide for visitors to Rangeley called Wilhelm Reich in Rangeley, the unlikely story of in the Maine woods or something like that, that gives broad strokes of his background, the topics that he covered, his influence on society, and what goes on here. But there's a lack of a comprehensive yet accessible introduction to Reich's work. And many have tried. There are books, there's none of which we can recommend wholeheartedly. One of our projects internally is we still publish Reich's works in pretty much the same formats in which he originally published them. And one of our projects is to sort of create a new series out of Reich's actual writings, but reorganized in terms of topics of interest to the contemporary audience. Because, for example, breathwork is a big thing right now, right? Reich had a lot to say about breathwork, about breathing, about the centrality of, this breathing to biological pulsation and health. But to find those chapters, you'd have to go, read chapter 3 in this book and chapter 4 in that book. So one of our longer term projects will be Reich on biological pulsation and breathing, Reich on marriage and family issues, Reich on, with his own writings, with maybe some introductions and in order to orient the reader so that his language, his particular jargon can be understood. When he says whatever, he means trauma, for example.
Yeah. I would love to see the Wilhelm Reich reader, 600 pages. Take that, Sigmund Freud. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Well, actually, as we finish up, let's just talk about this glorious facility and building that is in Rangeley, Maine, that I've driven all the way from Pennsylvania here to see. Please like and subscribe at the Acid Horizon Patreon because I need to pay for gas on the way back. But tell us about this place as a place to visit and this area in particular.
The Rangeley Lakes region is just a gorgeous area of mountains and lakes that has been an attraction for fishermen and boaters and skiers. And we have a ski mountain, one of the biggest ones in Maine, right practically in town, for many decades. And which is what attracted Reich to this area, which sort of reminded him of the place where he was from in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, when Reich took over this particular 280-acre property at the time, now it's 200 acres, he constructed a cabin to live in on the lake. He had the shore of Dodge Pond was part of his property. He constructed what he called the Students' Laboratory down the hill in 1945. And then the Orgone Energy Observatory, a Bauhaus international-style structure that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Very unusual for the Northeast because it has large flat roofs. And that's because he wanted to be able to go outside and see the atmosphere around him. This was essential to his scientific research. He also insisted that the building be built of local field stone, not brick, not wood, although there were some wood portions. He said, build your life on rock. And he did. And it's in a gorgeous building. I know you'll be dropping in some photos. It recently underwent, a restoration, thanks to the Ephraimson Family Fund of Indiana. Go ahead.
And there is a shower on the roof, which is amazing. Now I want to shower on my roof. Why did he have a shower on the roof?
Well, same reason you'd like to have one. It was a pretty secluded place, and according to his son, he wore his underpants. But anyway,
just in case. I mean, telescopes were around, right? So,
yeah. Well, he had most of them here. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous place, and I hope your listeners and viewers will see this in the photographs. It's breathtaking, and one of the reasons we get as many visitors as we do, even though we're in a very remote part of Maine, is because of the spectacular views and the spectacular architecture here. So even if you've never heard of Wilhelm Reich and aren't interested in Wilhelm Reich, it's worth coming here.
Great. Professor Bennett, David, I want to thank you for having me at the Wilhelm Reich Museum. This has been a fantastic interview.
Thank you.